Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our first breakout session for today.
Good morning.
We are joined here with Jennifer Wright. She's from the Spartanburg County Public Libraries, and she is going to be talking about emotional intelligence for library staff.
All right, thank you, Megan. I appreciate it. And please let me know if you run into any audio issues or if anyone can't hear me. Today I am talking about emotional intelligence, and I've called this presentation The Rise of EQ. Sorry, it has nothing to do with Star Wars, but we are going to be talking about emotional intelligence for library staff in particular. And right off the bat, I will go ahead and let you know that my office is right next to our children's section. So if you happen to hear some little voices while I'm presenting, that's why, and I'm sorry about that. But emotional intelligence is a really exciting topic that's sort of come to the forefront of discussions of employee success in the workplace. Researchers really now believe that emotional intelligence is probably the single strongest predictor of success in the workplace, and the same is true in the library workplace as well. In fact, there's a study that showed that 90% of the top performers out there in any given organization are skilled in emotional intelligence. They have higher skills than some of their counterparts who are not as successful. So in this session, we're going to review the most important EQ skills. We're going to talk about testing and training, and discuss building EQ competencies at work. And since I am a trainer, I'm going to talk a little bit about if you happen to do training as part of your position in the library, how you can roll that out to staff. So I do want to introduce myself. I'm Jennifer Wright. I'm the Director of Planning and Training for the Spartanburg County Public Libraries here in the upstate. I did include my contact information on this slide, and I've also uploaded the handout version of my slides today, so please feel free to contact me. My presentation is maybe even a little bit overloaded with information, so if you have any questions or you'd like any of the materials that I talk about today, I would be happy to share those with you. All right, so I like to sort of recap in advance what I'm going to cover today. And the first thing we're going to cover is the definition of emotional intelligence and some concepts that tie in there very closely. We're going to talk about the most important skills that come with emotional intelligence, because I like to be very practical when I'm doing any kind of conference presentation. We're going to talk about a case study and some research that I've done and how that can be used constructively for training. And then finally, we're also going to talk about some strategies for developing our own emotional intelligence skills, or if you are a supervisor or a trainer, ways to do that with your employees. So a lot to cover today, and I hope there's some information here that you all find helpful. So let's start by asking the question, what is emotional intelligence? Or as you can see on this slide, EQ. So I'm going to give you a summary that is really mine, borrowed from a number of places, and a little bit later I'll share some definitions from other researchers. I'll be giving a lot of information in this section about the nature of emotional intelligence, but this is really sort of the heart of it. Emotional intelligence is often abbreviated either EI or EQ, because EQ is similar to IQ, which of course is what we might call regular intelligence. It mainly represents four concepts, and the first one is the ability to correctly identify one's own emotions. The more that we start to self-reflect and self-analyze, the more we realize that this is much harder than it sounds. And in fact, most of us are probably not very good at it unless we practice. Second, it also involves managing those emotions once you've identified them. So again, managing your emotions, that's something that can be very challenging. Those two first aspects are really very internal, but emotional intelligence also deals with external interactions, and those are the second two bullet points on this slide. This involves the ability to correctly identify the emotions of others. So it would involve things like empathy, being able to put ourselves in someone else's shoes, understand someone else's feelings based on a situation, things we'll talk about later a lot more. And finally, then there at the end, then using that knowledge to respond appropriately to the emotions of others. So I also have just a few highlights, a brief history of some important and or interesting publications related to emotional intelligence. And I don't want to get way down in the weeds and spend a lot of time on this, but I do want to comment on a few of these things on the slide. The term emotional intelligence, you might be wondering where that came from. It actually pops up as early as 1985. But really, the most important definition was coined by two people called Salovey and Mayer, and that was around 1990. And they defined EQ, this is going to be a little bit more of an in-depth definition than mine, but they defined it as a form of social intelligence that involves the ability to monitor one's own and others' feelings and emotions. So kind of what I talked about already, to discriminate among them, and to use this information to guide one's thinking and action. So these two researchers are really the two who laid the groundwork for studying emotional intelligence in a scientific way. And if you start doing research about this, if you maybe get interested in the topic after this presentation, their names will crop up a lot. Another interesting guy on this slide is Daniel Goleman, and he can actually be credited largely with popularizing the idea of emotional intelligence. So he wrote a book called Emotional Intelligence. It was published around 1996. And then, sort of to everyone's surprise, it made the cover of Times Magazine, and then he started appearing on different TV shows. He appeared with Oprah Winfrey, with Phil Donahue. He even did a speaking tour, and his book became this international bestseller and was on the New York Times bestseller list. And he got so popular that actually other researchers started to get a little irritated, and they called him a sellout. But he actually did a lot to move this concept forward and keep it in the public eye. So move it maybe from something that researchers were interested in to something that many more people were interested in as well. I also, in this introductory section where we're defining concepts, I want to talk about the work of Paul Ekman, and I'll explain a little bit more later why I'm talking about his work. He's another important researcher, and his research has a lot of relationship to emotional intelligence. So Paul Ekman is a psychologist. He's also a professor at the University of California, San Francisco, I believe. And he's really a pioneer in the study of emotions and their relation to facial expressions. So I kind of hinted at this already when I talked about how in emotional intelligence, part of it is being able to recognize how other people are feeling and the emotions that they are experiencing. He's actually now considered one of the most influential psychologists of the 21st century. And this is kind of a fun fact. He is also the world's lead deception detection expert. And so he was the inspiration behind that series Lie to Me, if you ever watched that television show, a pretty good television show, actually. So what I want to talk about today on the next slide, though, is his theory of universal emotions. And once again, I'm going to tie this in more closely to emotional intelligence in a later section. So he's a pioneer in something called universal emotions. And what I've added here on the slide is the word families of. So it's universal families of emotions, because he and emotion scientists are not saying that you can only feel 7 emotions and that's it. Obviously, no emotion exists as a single psychological state. Instead, there are these families of related emotional states. And the interesting thing is that these groups of emotions across cultures are universally displayed through facial expressions. So it's almost, they call it a language of expressions. And the more you research this and look into it, the more interesting it gets. So what does this have to do with emotional intelligence? Well, it really ties to the idea of emotional awareness and being able to correctly identify the emotions of others in a given situation, and then modify your response accordingly. So I realize that's a lot, but I'm not going to get into sort of the nitty-gritty of his theories. Just that that's an important concept. And if you're interested in perhaps studying this concept more, he actually has quite a fascinating website that sort of shares all his research and the research done by his counterparts as well. And so I've actually listed on this slide the web address at where he talks about this. So keep that concept in mind as we go forward. While we're defining emotional intelligence, or as I'm abbreviating it today, EQ, I want to talk a little bit about the benefits. So we haven't quite gotten into how do you practice emotional intelligence. That will be in the next section. But while we're just defining it, I also want to define the benefits, why people are so interested in studying this and why it's so important. So let's talk quickly about some personal and then professional benefits of EQ. So let's set work aside for a moment and think about the personal benefits of developing emotional intelligence skills. All this is research based. There's a lot of research going into this. People with high EQ skills really tend to communicate better with the people in their lives. And of course, that's sort of a foundation for many other types of success is that communication. They tend to better manage and also reduce their own anxiety and stress. If you think about the current year and the pandemic, that sort of ability becomes more important than ever. And also when conflicts arise, they're more capable. Of course, this is a generalization. None of us are perfect all the time, but they tend to be more capable of diffusing conflict or making it into a constructive conflict, so a learning opportunity. And that improves their relationships. They do tend to better empathize with others and also display improved change management skills. And of course, change management skills are what help you cope with those challenges and adapt to change. And that's really important in any kind of environment. And certainly, I want to add that emotional, or sometimes it's called social intelligence training, which I'll reference later, the training aspect of this is not just for people who are neurotypical. So people who are more neurodiverse, and of course, that's a really wide spectrum, but for example, people with high functioning autism, they can take training in things like emotional intelligence, social intelligence, and that helps them have a better life experience because they can build more of those skills. And there's some interesting research out there about that. Let's pivot to work benefits. And this, I think, will really interest you if you are in management or administration somewhere. So, really, obviously, all those personal benefits of emotional intelligence can be translated into the workplace. But I think these benefits, again, should get us supervisors pretty excited about the potential of EQ and doing some training in this area. High EQ employees are generally more productive. They also, and this is an important one, I believe, for anyone, they're able to receive critiques of their work better in general and tend to use that to improve instead of resenting feedback. And so then, unsurprisingly, they also tend to get along better with other staff, not just with their supervisors. And then there's also studies that have shown improved motivation, time management, and leadership skills. And this last one is why research has found that people in leadership tend to have higher emotional intelligence skills in general. Some of that comes perhaps from a natural tendency, but a lot of that comes from the training opportunities that they've taken advantage of or the way that they've developed themselves. So again, we'll touch on this a little bit later when we talk about training and kind of how I think this is so important for employee training in libraries. All right, so we've laid a foundation here, and I hope I haven't lost you, but it's the definition, the benefits. I think that's all important to know. That's probably review for some of you who perhaps have already had an interest in this topic. But let's get a little bit more practical because, again, I like to try to make as much as possible, even a presentation like this, that's more high level, I like to try to make it more practical. So let's talk about some of the actual skills, the practices that are part of emotional intelligence. And then we're going to move on into how that can be incorporated into training. So I mentioned someone named Goldman. He was that guy that was really popular and everyone thought he was a sellout, but he actually did some really great work. I want to share with you his theory of EQ because it's a little bit more complex than what I've shared so far, but it's some actual practices. So, emotional self awareness. Well, what does that even mean? All right. It's being aware of what you're feeling in the moment and why. We'll talk a little bit later about actually developing the tendency to do that. That ties closely with self regulation. So, that's the idea, that's a practice of noticing when you're having an emotion, anticipating how you normally act when you have that emotion, and then stopping yourself from acting on impulse. This skills list, I'm not going to go through it in a lot of depth because we'll kind of tie this in as we move through this practical section. But it also includes the concepts of motivation and empathy, and then social skills. And social skills is sort of this umbrella. It's about how you manage your relationships with people, for example, coworkers or a boss. And then for leaders, it's the ability to inspire other people to action and to motivate them. So, really, if you think about it, one of the easiest ways to identify EQ skills is to think of someone you've met. Perhaps certain library patrons come to mind, someone who did not have those skills. So I think of some patrons who, I think of one who couldn't get into her email, got upset, started yelling profanities in the library. And obviously that did not go well. Very frustrating situation, trying to get into her email, couldn't remember the password, couldn't retrieve her password because she needed a pin, didn't have her cell phone, so anybody would be frustrated at that. But that's a reaction, an extreme reaction that tends to come from a lack of emotional intelligence. It doesn't mean that the person is a bad person. It just means they have not developed that skill. And then a person with higher emotional intelligence skills can recognize their frustration level and take steps to regulate themselves before they lash out and do harm to themselves or others. And this type of training is actually becoming really popular with new parents. You may have heard that "Don't shake, take a break" slogan for families with young children, young babies especially. A lot of times, physical abuse can be tied to, unfortunately, adverse life circumstances that cause a lot of frustration and stress. And so, giving people that training, especially young parents, giving people that training on emotional intelligence can assist with that. Same thing with training for individuals who were formerly incarcerated. Emotional intelligence skills are often built into a lot of those trainings to help folks readapt and then get ready for new job opportunities. And of course, that could probably be a whole other conference presentation. Let's talk about a few other things that you might see from someone who does not quite have those EQ skills. They're likely to have emotional outbursts, usually out of proportion to the situation at hand. They might have difficulty listening to others. They might become argumentative easily. They blame others generally because taking personal responsibility is difficult for them. They may believe, and you may have seen this even with employees if you're in a supervisor position, they may believe that other people are just oversensitive, and that's why they're always upsetting people, when really the problem is that they don't know how to interact with others. And so, of course, they may have difficulty maintaining friendships and relationships and seeing other people's points of view. So I want to emphasize here again that I'm not trying to be mean in this summary. Just because someone's emotional intelligence is underdeveloped does not mean that they're a bad person or that they can't learn. There are actually studies that have shown that people can improve these skills. Some people come from an underprivileged background where they just have not learned these. But that means that if you have an employee, a library employee, who has underdeveloped skills, that if you're in a position where you can mentor and develop or train them, you can actually improve their work overall and their work experience and their success. They can improve. And I think that's very important to remember. So, what about people who do have those EQ skills? Let's take some practical examples, and some of these I've touched on already. Recognizing frustration and when to take a break. I've already talked about that. The ability to compromise. Some people think that sounds like a really bad thing, but actually compromising is just part of collaborating with others. Two people need to do a presentation together. One of them likes one certain kind of PowerPoint, one of them likes another one. That's an example of, to a place where compromise just has to be natural. It's not that important. And yet sometimes you might see someone with those underdeveloped EQ skills where they put their foot down on everything and they struggle to compromise even on the small things. Ability to practice empathy toward people who are not like you. I've got a few others here. I'm not going to touch on all of them, but taking responsibility, that's really the heart of the bullet point about accepting blame and moving forward with guilt. Very important in a workplace. And perhaps when a situation goes badly with a patron, I often see, people either um, they get very frustrated and stuck because they keep worrying and thinking about how it could have gone better, or they entirely blame the patron, maybe even if there was some library fault. So this can actually really help with customer service skills as well. And that leads me right to the next one: recognizing the true cause of a bad mood instead of taking it out on others. This one always makes me laugh because I think this is something that we all have done, perhaps with our significant others. And I always remember the story that Brene Brown told, the author and researcher Brene Brown, about how she dropped her coffee and immediately her mind jumped to blaming her husband, even though he wasn't in the house at the time. But she started thinking, oh, he came in late last night. I couldn't sleep without him. And now I'm so tired. And because I'm tired, I'm clumsy. And now I dropped my coffee. It's all his fault. And then, of course, being skilled in emotional intelligence, she recognized that that was just her own frustration and was able to laugh about it. But that recognizing the true cause of a bad mood instead of taking it out on others is so important, and is really important in the workplace too. And that leads us to just a few other practical examples within the workplace that I want to talk about. So Kelly Miller, who's an author with Positive Psychology, this is, and I do have a slide a little bit later with resources on it if you'd like to look at those. Um, she really shares some of this research, and that's where I got this from. So in a workplace that overall prioritizes emotional intelligence, where it's just part of the culture, you usually see that these statements are true of staff, obviously with exceptions, but in general, this tends to be more true. And that's why it's so important that this interest and knowledge about emotional intelligence kind of comes from the top in an organization. So when EQ is common to a workplace culture, people do tend to express themselves more openly and respectfully. And I think both of those words are equally clear and important to hear, because respectful communication can also be open, and then open communication can also be respectful. And that's something that I think any administrator would want to see. Resilience is evident when new initiatives are introduced. So you don't have as many of those people who push back at every attempt at change. And that, of course, ties into the next bullet point, which is flexibility. Employees tend to enjoy spending time together. There's more creativity and active listening. And then there tends to be more compassion. And of course, compassion and empathy and library service, we really are a serving profession. So having the capacity for compassion and empathy, both with our coworkers and with our patrons, is so important to success in a library job. And of course, can help us to avoid things like burnout and then performance or behavioral issues when trying to interact with difficult patrons. So if you look at all this, this is a lot. I realize it's all tied up in that original definition. It all comes back to that original definition of being aware of ourselves, our emotions, managing those, and then also being able to look at someone else, put yourself in their shoes, understand how they're feeling potentially in a situation, and then modify our approach to that. And really what I described there is not just emotional intelligence. It's also, if you think about library service, it's good customer service. That's the foundation for good customer service. And it's also the foundation for good leadership and even getting along with your fellow employees. So for all these reasons, I believe that emotional intelligence is very, very important to the function and the successful operation of libraries and library staff. So that sort of leads me into my own research. I happen to be really fortunate to be working on a doctorate right now in organizational leadership. And one of my areas of research that I'm very interested in is emotional intelligence and trying to get more librarians and library staff interested in that. And so I have done a little bit of research here, including a case study, and I want to talk a little bit about its importance for EQ testing and then training for library staff. And so I recently conducted a little case study with some volunteer library staff in South Carolina who agreed to take an EQ test as a training tool and then kind of report back to me on their experience. And as a trainer, I thought that it gave me some really interesting observations that I'm going to summarize briefly today. So I had about 46 volunteer participants. They're all public library staff members, big variety in job titles, years of experience, and then also diversity of age, race, ethnicity, gender identity, ability, so forth. And so what they had to do, which was not a lot, but it was certainly a little bit of a time commitment, they had to complete a 20-minute test. And it's something called an Emotify test. And I'm going to show you some pictures from that in just a second, because it's a really fascinating test, a little bit different than your normal standard test. And then the testing software grouped their results into 5 categories. And so that ranged from far above average, so really, really good results, all the way down to far below average. So some improvement needed there, of course. And then I could also see a numeric percentile score. And because I didn't invent the Emotify test, it comes from an outside organization. They had already done what they call norming. So across the whole population of people who've taken this test, they kind of normed that. And so I could see a percentile. How did this person do on the test compared to everybody else? So if they scored in the 75th percentile, that meant that they had scored better than 75% of people. And so that was very interesting information. And I did find, I don't mention this later, but I'll just throw this out there. I did find that in general, the staff who are working in libraries, that they all had slightly above average. Well, not all of them, but overall they had slightly above average emotional intelligence, overall. And I thought that was interesting because I do feel like this is really important to the library profession. And probably a lot of folks getting into libraries already have some natural interest in empathizing with and helping people. All right, so then after completing the test, these folks also received a brief follow-up survey, and that survey really encouraged self-analysis and got their perspective on the test after they completed it. So let me talk to you a little bit about this Emotify test. So here are a couple pictures from it, and I'll explain a little bit more about what it involved. It had 2 sections. One was called Matching Faces, and as you might guess, that ties back to our universal emotions discussion. And then the second was called Emotional Ties. I got access to this test, and I'm extremely fortunate to have access to it because we already have this software called Hire Select that we use for pre-employment testing, and I was able to get it through that because I like to use testing software for various training purposes as well. You can adapt a lot of different tests, and measure for example, people's word skills before and after a class on Microsoft Word and things like that. So you can get creative with it. And if anyone wants to talk more about software, testing software, the test itself, I'm happy to share information on that. I can probably go on all day, but I won't about that particular topic. So the Emotify test, like I said, 2 sections, they're both game-based. Game-based tests are really interesting because they really have been shown to keep test takers more engaged. And then also they tend to be more accurate than those tests where people just have to rate themselves on a scale. Because when people are rating themselves, sometimes they will rate themselves how they wish they were. It's something we all do. We're all guilty of this. And we might rate ourselves how we wish we are rather than how we actually are. So this was really designed to eliminate that. So what they had to do was first look at someone's face and try to correctly identify the emotion on that person's face. And then in the second part of this test, they had to read about a situation, an experience that someone had, and then think about how that person would feel and how their face might look, how their expression might look in response to that particular situation. And it is kind of interesting. Once again, I certainly won't go into all the details of how the test was created, but they actually took pictures of people actually experiencing these emotions, and they took thousands and thousands of pictures when creating this test. So it's sort of a fascinating tool to use. So that's what I used with the staff. And then for the follow-up survey, just used that little tool called SurveyMonkey, which is so great. So what did this case study show me? Well, this really yielded a few interesting points. And so in order not to bore you too much today, I'm only going to touch on a few of those. And one thing that I did notice right off the bat was that supervisors, it was not a huge difference, but they really did tend to have higher test scores. Now, this is where we go back to some of the existing research that shows that, overall high performers in an organization tend to have better emotional intelligence skills. And so what this really says to me, if you look at this, we've got the two taller columns are our supervisor mean and median. So those are, basically types of averages, or if you will. And then the non-supervisor mean and the non-supervisor median, you can see those are a little bit lower. And so what that shows to me is that if I were a person, perhaps a new librarian, interested in getting a leadership position, this is an area where I would really focus my personal development is in emotional intelligence, because it's so vital to interacting and dealing with people, which of course is a lot of what leadership, administration, management is all about. And then also I would postulate here as well that if you had a supervisor whose score really was lower than the mean or median, that in order to make that supervisor more successful, it would be great if that supervisor would willingly, or perhaps even if the training was assigned to them, take training on emotional intelligence in order to build their skills and become more successful in their leadership position. And that leads me into something else. Once again, I know that this is probably not the most thrilling screen ever, but I will talk you through it. So in the follow-up survey, I asked whether the people who'd taken this test thought that it was helpful. Is it helpful for training and learning? They could answer yes, or they could answer no. And so I had two groups. I had a yes group and I had a no group. So it turns out that people who saw value in the test for training purposes also tended to score much, much higher on the test. So if you look at my mean score percentile, again, I know, boring graph, I'm sorry. But if you look at my yes group, they scored much, much higher than the no group overall. And so what this was really interesting, I even ran some of those really boring statistical tests and found that there was a significant difference statistically between these two groups. Just really interesting difference, because what that says to me is that maybe people who have underdeveloped emotional intelligence skills, they haven't quite worked on that as much as they should. They don't recognize necessarily the value of emotional intelligence training. And so that might not be something they would go out and pursue on their own if they don't see a benefit to it. So that might mean that if you are in a position where you are a supervisor, or you are an administrator, or you're a trainer, if you see someone who really needs these skills, it might be incumbent on you to suggest to them that they take a training in this area, that they develop their skills in this area, not to critique them, or again, not to be mean, I've said that earlier, but because if someone is underdeveloped in these areas, they're not going to be as successful in the workplace and in library service, interacting with our patrons. And so I really believe that leadership, people in charge of training in libraries need to promote and maybe even require EQ training for staff, because otherwise the people who need it most, like the people who are on our front lines, on our front desks, they may not necessarily get that training if we don't push it out to them. And also, I think it's great to share research and just talk to employees in libraries about what is emotional intelligence. There's not a lot of research out there right now about emotional intelligence in libraries. Not a lot of people are talking about it in libraries yet. It's sort of filtering through other types of organizations and companies and then coming to us gradually. And so I would love to see more talk about that in our libraries. So finally, let's talk about actually developing EQ skills, because I said that they could be learned. What does this all mean? We know now that emotional intelligence is important. You may have already known that if you were interested in this area, but we've emphasized that. And we know that these skills can be developed and everyone can reap the benefits, especially, once again, if we're talking about someone in leadership or who wants to be in leadership. And we also know that the people in charge need to help everyone see the importance of becoming an emotionally intelligent organization. So, if you're with me today, you're listening to this presentation, you're probably already open to the idea of EQ training, or maybe after everything I've said, now you're thinking about some strategies to use with your staff if you're a supervisor, or maybe you just want to develop your own EQ skills. I don't have time to do an exhaustive training on this topic, but here are just a few tips and tricks that I want to talk about. And you can go online and find all kinds of different resources and read some excellent books to help you develop these skills as well. These I pulled some of these from a consulting company called Roche Martin, and I think these strategies are just a good starting place for individual development. So let's just hit on a few of these key points. Number one, take time out of your hectic schedule to just notice your emotions. One thing that I have done sometimes is if I am feeling stressed or upset or whatever, just sit down and make a list of everything that you're stressing about. And certainly right now we have more things to be stressed about than ever. So that might be a good practice. And then in the next column, after you've written everything down, write down something you can do to address that source of stress. So that's a little practice that you can do. When you start to pay attention to emotions and where those emotions are showing up almost as a physical feeling, um, you'll start to recognize when you're feeling an emotion. It will become almost second nature. And that leads us right into the second one, which is then pay attention to how you're behaving and start observing how the way you act when you're experiencing certain emotions, how that changes and how it affects your day-to-day life. Managing our emotions becomes easier once we become more conscious of how we're reacting to them. One thing that I like that I included here is that question your own opinions, because part of EQ, remember, is related to flexibility and empathy. And so in our world today, it's very polarized. We can often fall into a thought bubble where we only interact with people who think and feel like us. So even if you know or believe that your views are right, take time to have your views challenged. Try to put yourselves in other people's shoes, put yourself in situations that demand empathy and be more receptive to new ideas. And I think in a library, what that means is putting yourself in the shoes of patrons, even when we don't always perhaps even like the person, but we have to help them. Another one on here, number 4, that I appreciate is take responsibility for your feelings. If you're a supervisor, this is something that you can encourage amongst your staff, but emotions and behavior come from you. They don't come from anybody else. Once people start accepting responsibility for how they react to feelings, that can actually be very constructive for the interaction of employees between each other. And then I'll also mention that last one, that number, actually it's not the last one on my slide, but number 5 there. and then we'll skip over those last two. But number 5, take time to celebrate the positive. This is one that is really, I think, a very practical way to develop EQ is to try to become a more positive person. If you interact with a person who is consistently negative, often part of their struggle may be underdevelopment of emotional intelligence. And so take time to celebrate the positive. What does that mean practically? Well, and I think that some staff that I've talked to about this would say I talk about it too much, but I really like the idea of what they call a gratitude journal. And that sounds like a lot, or it might sound kind of cheesy. You don't have to write a whole journal, but it's just like taking time periodically to write down good things, or maybe not even write them down, just think about them. Good things in one's life or good things in one's workplace, and remind yourself of the positive. So again, I know it sounds cheesy, but it's actually one of the best strategies out there for this, for development of EQ, and also for stress management. So, all right, let's talk a little bit about manifesting emotional intelligence at work. Whenever I say an assertive style of communicating, you'll notice this first bullet point says use an assertive style of communicating. Whenever I say that, I do want to mention that it does not mean being aggressive or being a jerk. Assertive communication, as you probably know, just means being able to communicate your opinions and needs in a direct but respectful way. We've already kind of touched on that. So that's one of the ways that you can manifest emotional intelligence at work, is work on your communication style. Respond instead of reacting to conflict. This goes back to that old suggestion of, if an email makes you angry, walk away for an hour before you answer it, or longer if you need to. And then during instances of conflict, maybe face-to-face conflict or with a patron even, just know emotional outbursts, feelings of anger, those are common. But a person with more developed emotional intelligence skills has developed strategies, and they have to be unique to you, but strategies to help yourself calm down and stay calm during a stressful situation. Number 5, we have that idea of positivity again, yay. And then skipping down to number 6, an important part of increasing emotional intelligence is to be able to take critique. This is so important at work. And I think this is something that can be developed with employees, especially if you're in a position where you have to offer feedback or maybe do personnel reviews with the person, talking about how to approach that, how to handle that with someone. Instead of getting offended or defensive, high EQ people do tend to kind of step back, look at the critique more objectively, see where they can incorporate it into their performance, and then sometimes, of course, see which parts they'll reject. But it's, instead of being a reactive feeling, they can take critique better because they take it as constructive criticism. And then, of course, number 7, leadership skills. Well, that can mean anything, right? So what am I talking about here? Leadership skills that are associated with emotional intelligence tend to be things like setting or modeling high standards of performance yourself, or taking initiative, and once again, modeling that for your employees, and then stepping up to problem solve and encouraging your employees to problem solve. All of those are strategies, leadership skills that can build your own emotional intelligence, that practice it at work, and then can also pass that along to your employees. Because if you are in a management position, remember that everything you do is sort of, I don't want to use the word infecting, but basically spreading outward, spreading downward to your employees. And all of these things can be hard. And emotional intelligence does come more naturally to some people rather than others, but with practice, anybody can improve their skills. And it just takes a willingness to engage in self-reflection and self-improvement. And I will add to this that yesterday I had the privilege of also presenting on EDI training, equity, diversity, and inclusion. And I think that these two really tie well together, because when you develop your emotional intelligence skills to put yourself in someone else's shoes and to think and reach out to other people and consider other opinions, that's going to benefit libraries at large, because that means that we're opening the door even further to examining ourselves, examining our organizations, at where we're failing at equity and where we can do a better job. So I want to sort of end with a few recommendations. There are a few books on the slide that I recommend that you read if you're interested in. The first one, of course, is the classic Goleman book. Emotional Intelligence 2.0 is a classic. The third one is good, and I also just included it because it has a great title that makes me laugh. And then the third one, the fourth one is a very practical book. So if there's something you just wanted that's shorter and more practical, the EQ Edge will do that for you. And then also, maybe getting a little silly here, but I'm actually quite serious. I have 3 movies to watch, especially I'm going to say Inside Out. I know that it's a children's movie. You don't have to have kids to enjoy it though, but Inside Out is actually a movie that's really all about emotional intelligence, and it kind of presents it in a fun way, but I think it's great. And then the other 2 there are really good about making you think about putting yourself in someone else's shoes. So if you don't have time to read a whole book, sit down and watch one of these movies thinking about emotional intelligence, and that will maybe get you even more interested in this topic. Once again, I do have a number of resources. You can download the handouts from this presentation from the site that Megan shared. And now, if anyone has any questions, I would be happy to do my best to answer questions. And if I can't answer it right now, then I would be happy to look it up and get back with you later. And I will just, while I'm waiting to see if anyone has any questions, someone made just a wonderful comment in the chat that said that as you open yourself up to critique and people give you feedback, that can be a tough feeling and make you feel inadequate, but it actually shows you that you've done a great job of being approachable. I love that. Yes. In training staff, so what I like for emotional intelligence training, well, right now we have to do online or virtual training. What I like is in-person group training, but of course, right now, due to the pandemic, everything is virtual. I think that will continue probably for a good while. So I'm just in answer to that question. I think that probably if you have the opportunity to do webinars, that's kind of been my favorite way to do training right now, because some of our folks are really good about commenting and interacting during a webinar, but we don't have much attendance there, of course. So it's going to have to be individual online. I think that can be just as effective. Can you please reshare the link to the site with the down? Oh, okay. Yes. So Megan, I think someone asked if you could reshare the link to the site with the downloads. All right. Well, thank you all so much for attending. Megan, I'll turn it back over to you. Please feel free to share any questions that you have with me.
Thank you so much. And yeah, so I am recording all of the sessions.